Hi, welcome back to the jQuery Jumpstart. We're going to pick up with Module 2 and jQuery selectors. Sound good?
Sounds vital.
Okay. Yeah, actually vital. So selectors are the core part of jQuery. You really can't do anything at all in jQuery without knowing how to work with selectors. Even, as you mentioned before, Jeremy, the ready function, you can even use that, runs as a selector, and then wraps up everything into this nice little jQuery object that we get to work with. So we're going to dig in for the next 45 minutes or so about how to do selectors and what they're all about. So if we bring up the slides, then we could start looking at what we might have. Sorry? Do you have?
Oh, yeah, we should have the slides on both of our screens. Do you have them on yours?
Nope.
All right.
Well, that's okay. So selectors, anyway, as we saw the dollar syntax, so you can use the $sign and then a selector, there we go, to be able to work with them. Now, all of the jQuery selectors are derived from CSS selectors. So if you're a CSS ninja, you're probably going to be pretty good at jQuery right out of the gate. If you just can't even function in CSS, jQuery will actually help you get better with it. So it's kind of cool. No matter what side you come from, you're going to end up kind of knowing CSS a little bit better in the end.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, how about if I talk to the folks for a second about CSS, what it means and where it came from and stuff like that, while you get the slides rolling on your box. That way it'll make it a little bit easier for us in this section. So you know what I'm going to do, folks, is take you back to the code pen that we were just looking at. And I told you that every pen, every web app, every page is basically made up of its HTML, its CSS, and its JavaScript, which is super cool for us because it's kind of these three completely different components of the page. The HTML is the structure of it. It's like what elements should exist, where should they go, stuff like that. What order are they in? That's the structure. The CSS is the style and layout, so it's all the nice stuff. It's what makes it look right, it's what puts things in the right place, it's what puts the borders on things, makes things the right colors, brings in images, not all the images, but background images and things like that. So that's the role of the CSS, and then the JavaScript is the logic. It's the if this, then that type of stuff. And it might be difficult for folks to say, well, what does the CSS have to do with my jQuery then? So Rachel's talking about these selectors, and what do the two have to do with each other? And they don't necessarily out of the chute, but jQuery did a really smart thing in saying, let's take the ability that we already have to put these, to select any object, any element or list of elements on my page by doing this one string. Now, if you happen to be familiar with XPath, it's kind of similar to the way that we used to pull elements out of XML using XPath. And CSS selection it's different than XPath. There's some things that do or don't overlap with the functionality in XPath, but it's really easy. It's much easier than CSS. I'm sorry, than XPath. And jQuery, like I said, made a good decision in saying, let's just use this selector syntax in jQuery. So I'm going to show you in my pen here. Remember I had this div that says hello div, that's its ID. And what it does is it results in this super tiny string here that you guys can't hardly read. It's too small. And let's actually get rid of this JavaScript that's causing it to print a function out on the screen and just say hello. So I want to select that div so that I can apply a style to it. And so I can use this selector. I can say div, I want this to be red, and I'm just showing you the basics here. I've turned this red by doing two things, by saying here's the element I'm interested in selecting, and here's what I want to do to it. Okay? So when Rachel talks about these CSS selectors, now that she's got her slides rolling, she's going to show you how jQuery is grabbing onto this awesome selector syntax and saying, let's just use that. we've got a good means for identifying certain elements on the screen. Let's just use that for identifying elements on the screen in our code. That makes sense, right?
Yeah, total sense.
Are you ready to roll?
Yeah, sounds good.
Good.
So, again, with selectors, CSS, that's kind of the big deal behind them, since we're going to use that same syntax. So we have selectors for all sorts of different things. Elements, just to grab a single element, maybe by its ID, by the attribute, by its name, by the type of element that it is. We can also select via the attribute values. Form elements, that's an important one. Forms are everywhere. Hierarchy, so we could do parent and child, descendants, all of those kind of attributes. Elements by state, so the checked checkbox, the disabled text box, something that's hidden, something that's selected, all of those kind of things.
Something borrowed, something blue.
All that good stuff. Yeah. By position and class. Only the classy ones, not the, right? So any way that you could think of manipulating or getting to DOM elements, you can do with jQuery. And behind a lot of these selectors are just good old-fashioned JavaScript, right? Because jQuery is basically just a JavaScript library. So if I'm selecting for something by its ID, you could pretty much consider that getElement by ID is running in the background. Or if I'm looking for all of the paragraphs, it's something like getElement by tag name, right? One of those kind of, something that you could write yourself. But
it's long.
Here it's long, right? It's long and it's kind of ugly, right?
Yeah.
So ugly code, it's harder to maintain. There's something about the aesthetic quality of code that's important, and jQuery does help that, makes it a lot easier. Plus, it melds very well with CSS as well, right? So we have that nice continuity between CSS selection and jQuery selection. So once we have our selectors up, all right, we can take a look at the basic syntax. Here it is now that we have slides. So the dollar, again, dollar is really important in jQuery, right? So it wraps up that whole function, and we use dollar to access it. Now, later on, way off in the end of this training, we'll talk about external libraries. And if anybody's wondering, like, hey, I have this other JavaScript library, and it uses a $sign too, because $sign is very popular in the land of script. Could there be a clash? Well, there could be, right, with some libraries. So we could talk about those later on. For now, the syntax is dollar, and then inside of your parentheses, you have double quotes or single quotes and the selector. And that selector part is what we're going to focus on in this chapter. Once we just select it, we can do things to it. So instead of just simply selecting objects to work with, we can then just select them and do something right at the same time. So the syntax is dollar parens, and inside of it your selector, and then dot method. And you can have one or more of these methods, which we'll talk about at the...
That's the chaining,
yeah,
right?
At the end of here, chaining. So we'll see a little bit of that. And then when you get into events methods more, we'll talk more about chaining in detail as well. So we can select something and do one or more actions on that something, just all in one fell swoop. Right, so that's good there. With selectors, we have this notion of specificity, which is also a notion in CSS. So when we go to select things, if we think about that DOM tree, it's a big old tree. And it has parents and children going off in the left branch and right and all over the place. And when we go to select things, we want to think about a few things. And one of them is, of course, performance. So if we go just, willy-nilly selecting stuff without any thought at all, we could be grabbing too many elements, or we can be supplying to jQuery maybe not the best selector that would do the job the best way. And it might make it a little bit slower because of what we pass to it. So we want to get specificity down and know how things work with both CSS and the DOM to be able to select things with precision, right? So that's kind of an important factor as well with jQuery. So we'll talk about all of that in this chapter. Something else we can do with selectors, multiples. So instead of just one thing, right, we can select multiple elements out of the DOM. And And we can do that easy enough with this kind of syntax, like a dollar and then multiple selectors, comma separated. So any selector that we need to, from 1 on to n. And you can do this with any selector at all. So it could be an actual selector for an element. It could be a selector for attributes. It could be a selector for anything in that list, a form, mix and match, however you need to do that. And actually, if we pop over here to CodePen, you had a nice example. And if I want to just do a basic selector and just do dollar, have my parens, double quotes in there, and I could just pick out any old thing that I want. So if I want to grab that table that's in there, I could just go to table and select that. This is in the CSS pane. It's probably not going to work there. How about we'll cut that out? Yeah, I'll be running that going, I don't know why that doesn't work. Oh, right, it's in the wrong place. So if I go ahead and run that, I can just select it. Now, we're not going to see anything necessarily right here in CodePen, so I'll bring up tools real quick. So if I go ahead and select my table, you can see here it gives me back, chose the selector, and it gives me back a nice little object and all the information about it. And it's wrapped up in its own little function, so I could get to all this cool stuff about it. If I wanted to dig in and just grab say all of the rows in that table, I can do that too. And then here I can see that I do have this other object. So I could go through anything that I want and select. I can even select, what else do we have in here? Let's see. Maybe the heading 1, heading 2. All right, so I could grab those. Comma separate H1 and H2. Then here we're going to see this object.
I wonder if we can get that text a little bit larger for the audience. I'm not sure if it's possible if you're not signed into CodePen, but maybe you can try the gear up next to the HTML.
Let's see if we could get that a little bit.
Does it have an option in there? Oh, you might have to hide the developer tools.
I don't really see anything. Yeah, and in developer tools, but you know what? We have zoom in on here.
There you go.
So that should run.
Answer to everything.
Answer to everything. I'd say here's CodePen. There we go. So now that we can zoom in and see this a little bit better. All right, so I have multiple paragraphs in here. There was an H1 and H2 tag as well up here at the top. All right, so I can zoom into there. So if we want to grab these different elements down here at the bottom, I just grabbed a selector for H1 and H2. And as you see, if I'm bringing back all of the H1 and H2s in here, it's going to return them in this object that has an array-like syntax. So I could drill into any of these and see all of the information about them. Nice, easy thing to do is do the comma separated if I need to get multiple selectors. Now, these selectors as well, I can do things like select by the element, which is what I've been doing, but maybe I don't want to just do that. Maybe I want to select by the class or an attribute or the first or the last or somewhere in there. Any of that kind of stuff that you might need to do, there is a selector for. So we'll go through all of those as well. Now that we just saw some basics of getting the selector and getting multiples in there, which is kind of where we're going to start with regular elements. Now the selectors, when we do this, and you see the little objects in the developer tools, jQuery is creating what's called a wrap set, right, or wrapper. So it wraps that up, and you can see it in the dev tools like that. And I can actually, if I ask for, say, all of the paragraphs in a table or in a page, it'll give me all of those in the wrap set. But I need to access maybe one in particular, and I could do that by this first piece of syntax here that you see on the slide, and that's by doing the selector and then its position. All right,
so this is possible because, like you said, this is an array, or at least an array-like object. And so what you're doing is you're accessing the first thing in that array. Is that right?
Exactly, in this case.
Okay,
yep.
And it's giving you an actual DOM element then, finally.
Yeah, at that point you get an actual DOM element. Okay. So you could do that with this nice little array-like syntax, and the other thing you could do is just selector and then call the get method.
Okay.
And then ask for which element you want, what position is in there.
Okay, so this is one of the things that, in my opinion, makes jQuery quite easy, because if you use the core JavaScript functions for doing selection, you have two different functions, query selector and query selector all. And you have to decide whether you think that you're going to get back one thing or multiple things, and you're going to act quite differently in those cases. And normally it's not really a problem because you know that you're looking for something by ID and there should only be one, or you're looking for all of the rows in a table, there should be many, but you have to think about that. And in jQuery, this wrapper it's nice the way it works because it may have 1 result or 0 results or 10 results. It doesn't really matter. It's going to treat that all the same way.
Yeah, that's really nice about jQuery. Whereas, the thinking, who likes doing that? Right? So we're developers. We just want to get the fastest thing, easiest. So here I get nice array notation when I'm working with a chunk of elements where actually even if it was by ID, rather than doing a query selector all, or query selector, I would just do a get element by ID, but the same thing applies. You have to think about what function you want to run first.
Yeah.
Then you have to do it. And as time progresses, if elements on the page change, you might need to go back and maintain that and revisit that later.
Yeah.
If requirements change, where this is a little bit easier to do that in jQuery. So. Also, with our selectors, like I mentioned just a few slides ago, you can run methods off of them. So if you want to do something like access this wrapped set and just work with it outside of the DOM and then attach it later, we'll see a little bit more in future chapters about this, but for now you can just do the selector syntax and then call the add method and add stuff to a wrapped set, but not the DOM. So that's nice. I can have a set of things off to the side that I want to work with and then later attach them to the DOM if I need them attached to the DOM.
Interestingly, I don't think I've ever used that.
Well, you know why I use it? It's performance. If you have, big old DOM, right? Big old chunk of DOM, and you're going to manipulate that, DOM access and traversal is expensive.
Yeah.
Right? So if we can pull things off to the side and work with them in memory and then put them back later, that's a great way to tune performance.
Sure.
And that's the way we could do that is with the add method after we've worked with the selector off to the side and got the elements we wanted and then added more to them. Okay, some more on the basic selectors here. And one place we could go, if we just go to jQuery online, let's bring up IE here, we'll go to jQuery. So once I get to the jQuery page, we have all this great documentation and whatnot. And right in here, we're going to see right away selectors and the API. When I come in here and see all these really, really good things, right? So this is where we want to go. If I come down here to manipulation, here's where I'm going to get all my good stuff. Once I figure out what selectors I want, then I could come in here and start working with all of these different elements. And there should actually be a category just for selectors. Let's see if that's the correct link. There we go. Here it explains you have all of your great characters that you could use, and a little point of note that I wanted to bring up. Often when we class things, we'll see this in just a second. Now I just selected something by class before, but if you run a class with name with the dot notation in it, it's a special character. So when you go to select that, you might need to do this, like do this foo, 2 backslashes, and then the dot to escape that. Okay. So there is an escape character. You might need that once in a while. I kind of like the dot syntax in CSS, right? It's kind of like the dot syntax in .NET namespacing. Right?
Yeah.
So it's very familiar. So that tends to goof up people quite a bit in the beginning. Yeah. So that's a little point that you want to remember. Outside of that, if we take a look here at basic selectors, the star for selecting everything. I don't really ever use this, but it's there, and it's the first selector we need to learn. Right?
And in fact, when you use a class, it's actually using the star implicitly.
Yeah.
It's the equivalent of star.class. In other words, any element type that has a class of whatever. But yeah, we don't end up using the star explicitly very often.
Right. And as we saw before, there's the element name. So you just type in the element by name. Or if we want to start getting more specific, element ID. And we start with pound and then the ID of what particular element we want. And of course, we should only have one ID, right? So there should not be duplicate IDs in your page. If there's other problems, right? Because that's really
Yeah.
meant to be a one thing. We probably want to go with a class instead of an ID.
Now, I wonder if it's confusing for some, the one just before where you said by the element name, because there is this concept of a name in the JavaScript. That's a little bit of a deprecated concept, but we're not talking about the name attribute.
Correct.
We're talking about the tag name.
The
so
tag
div,
name.
div, paragraph is P, and so on.
Anchors A, all that. Yeah, good point. So one of the other basic selectors, as we just saw too, is the class, which is a dot. And if you notice these, in CSS, if we want to set up an ID, we have the pound. If we want to set up a class, we have the dot. So it matches explicitly those CSS properties, which is pretty cool. So this way, we're not doing one thing in CSS and then doing something different in jQuery and completely messing ourselves up. If we completely mess ourselves up, it's going to be all over the place, not just in this half or that half. Right? If we want to move a little further to other selectors, such as attribute selectors, all of our tags have attributes. And it's very, very rare anymore that you just have a dry tag without a whole bunch of attributes. And even with HTML5, we have the data dash attributes, which are just awesome. I love those things. Those were what we used to hand roll and make our own before they were a standard. But here you can see various selector syntaxes for the attributes. So you just have your selector, and once you've done your selector in square brackets, we can either say, hey, I want a selector that just has this attribute. So maybe something that just simply has an ID attribute or has a background color attribute or whatever.
So something like required. Often
required is a
doesn't need
great
a value.
one.
Yeah.
It doesn't need a value. So just that the attribute exists. Select everything with that. Or we could do select something with an attribute that equals a particular value. Now that's a very popular one. So we want to look at something with a certain color or again required or whatever particular value some attribute might have that matches that selector. Then we have a few other ones here that are the attribute. We have these different symbols, right? So which ones contains is the star, and I forget what these other two are. It's either
terminates and that first one is begins with.
Begins with and ends with. That's the which way. So attributes begins and ends with, kind of like trimming and other kind of functions like that. So you could pick out attributes that are kind of fuzzy. I think it's like this, but we'll see, right? Kind of a pattern matching there. So we could do all of that good stuff, right, with our attribute selectors.
Yeah, like I've used that before where I had elements that were called something. This is not good practice, probably. This is a code smell, even in my own opinion. But where I had elements that had an ID of element 1, element 2, element 3, element 4, and I can just say if it starts with element, if the ID starts with element, then I'm interested in that one. So.
Yeah. Sometimes that works pretty well. Although, that could be a little bit of a smell. There's probably some other.
Probably classes.
Do that with classes would be, so actually attribute that. More selectors as well. So we could do the attributes. We can come back to hierarchy selectors. So we could do like an ancestor and a descendant, parent and child, previous and next, siblings and next. So I could pick a location in the DOM. I can select some elements from there, and then I can start kind of navigating, if you will. Not exactly traversal of the DOM, but just kind of honing in on one place and then picking out where I want to go from there. If I just want to pick out the children or a sibling or something like that.
Do we have a copy-paste error on that slide? Where for siblings and next element, they both used the plus sign there.
Right.
Is that correct?
Oh, wait, yeah. So sibling, actually, that might be a typo. I know the first one here, that should be it.
Okay.
Right? Previous, next.
Okay.
Yeah. So that might be a typo. So I found a typo before the actual spelling of the word hierarchy, but I corrected that. Some words you just can never spell correctly, no matter how many times you see them. So. Hierarchy is just one way to work with them. More would be positional. So we have your element, the selector that you want, and you can go to the first or the last, or any of the nth that you need to go to. And of course, we often need to, again, go to a particular location in the DOM and find out what the first or the last, especially if we're doing things like appending elements to the DOM or removing elements. As we do those kind of functions, we might need to see, well, what is first now and what's last now, as we're shuffling things around as far as the DOM goes. So let's take a look at some more filters here. So we'll go back to CodePen. Here we go. So anywhere in here that I want to select stuff, we have some classes here, like main text. All right, so here I can get this object, right, and it shows me everything, the selector, which is kind of nice. You can see the selector that you had. You can even see some of the stuff like previous object next in here as well. And some of the other ones that I might do is, let's see if I do, how about the div?
Do you mind zooming into that for me?
Oh, sure. Hold on a second here. If I go to maybe the first, we'll run this real quick. All right, so any of these, really easy way to get to learn jQuery is to come in here into your tools and then just start whipping out selectors and picking what you want out of these selectors, right? So here's the first element from the div that I selected, or actually the first element from all the divs. I didn't pick any particular div in here. I just said anything that is a div. But I could pick something by an ID or something like that as well. And of course with jQuery, you could take any of these selectors and you can have multiple selectors in one shot as well. So I could grab multiple IDs and apply something to them, or multiple classes or mixture of, along with the navigation and hierarchy type of selectors. So you really get a nice robust choice in being able to mix and match these things to get to whatever you need to in the DOM. What I like to do is I actually like to go to my own website here and play around too and see what's there. Now, I'm running a CMS, so I don't necessarily get the choice of, being able to just, pick out what I want outside of classes and things like that, although I can go into the code and change it if I want, but that's kind of against the point of having a blog, right? It's going to self-serve. So I could come in here and what I could do is start looking at the DOM by saying like, oh, what's in here? I have these little tiles and things like that. So I could come in here and once I know something, so I know I have some classes, like for the tiles on the right. So here I can see all of my tiles on the right. And it shows me here my div and the anchor. And this is the first one, right? Because I just asked for that. But I could come in here and I could get more specific. I can ask maybe, let's see, what else do we have in here? See all the divs that we have, right? So there's the first one. More classes. I could drop down and maybe I'll do the last, right? Nothing, no div last. Did I just not syntax that the right way? Okay, well, I forgot. I have the memory of like a fruit fly, right? And once I do something, I completely forget what the heck I've been doing. Again, simple selectors here. I could go in and grab a couple of paragraphs or things like that. So you have your choice as to what you want to do. But the easiest thing is just to go into any page and then just start playing around with selectors. So you might grab your F12 tools and then start just selecting things and then working into more specificity. I could do things like, here again with the comma separated, I could do things like pick out all the paragraphs, pick out the divs, and maybe, a tile left. So here I'll get a nice set of elements that matches what was in that selector. And in this case, I just wanted to grab a couple of random elements out of the DOM. That's perfectly fine too, if you want to do that. Okay, once we get basic selectors, and then as you see, all of these match out to CSS selectors. So things like first and last, all of your form stuff as well, those. anything that you could work in CSS, you could put into Selector, basically, and it's the same exact syntax. So that's kind of nice. I like that. And then you'll notice, if you were good at CSS before, jQuery will just simply be easy. But again, if you weren't good at CSS, then using these selectors will actually help you learn CSS, because you actually have to do that here with the selectors. Another part of selectors would be they're selectors, but we call them filters or sometimes extensions. And it's basically these ones in particular that are on the slide were added a little bit later. So they're not necessarily the same exact as you would see in CSS, but I can come in here and select kind of the type of an element here, a button, a password, a submit. Now I can also use an alternative syntax to get to these as well. But we have these nice little filters. So here in my selector, I could just have a colon and then that element. And there's many more if you just go to the jQuery site and look at the selectors in there. They call them filters as well in there. So anything that's out of a form, any of your controls, all that good stuff you'll find in here as a filter. So if I want to select, the password, I can get it by doing that :password. And
I think the real strong value there is that when you choose to use that method of doing it, then you get the cross-platform capabilities of jQuery. The library is capable of saying, well, I know that in this browser it works like this, and in this browser it works like this. So even though you could do it directly, if you use this, then you get that added advantage.
Right. And it's actually very clear to read these, where the syntax would be a little bit more elongated. You would have like input and then square brackets type equal text. Well, I could just put input, :input, or input type equal button or something like that, type equal submit. Instead, I just get these nice filters, and it's pretty clear by a scan of the eyes what's going on in the code. So all of these work exactly the same way. Some more filters as well. Here's the kind of like what we did with the starts with and ends with, right? It contains. So I could come in here and see what DOM elements contains a particular phrase of text. I can also do the not selector, right? Because we can't do things positively. You got to have the not, right? So whatever's not selected this way. So anything that's not a div, or anything that does not have an ID of X, or anything that's not in this class, which is kind of handy when I need to get those kind of things. So some more filters. And again, as you'll notice, it's the exact same syntax, but in this case, we just have a colon that starts us off, and then the rest of the, after contains whatever text it is, or the same with not, but a selector. So that selector could be a pound ID, it could be a dot class, it could just be an element name, it could be something that does not contain something else. So it could be any kind of mix and match that you need to be able to get to that element with filters. A little bit about chaining now.
Sure.
We saw a little bit about selectors. We feel comfortable with selectors, at least getting the idea. I mean, selectors are kind of that thing that once you see the pattern of how selectors work, you should be able to start coming up with whatever creative ideas you need to be able to select DOM elements. So we don't need to, as there's a lot more on a jQuery site you can go see, but we don't need to go through all of them, because once we get that notion or that pattern of how to do it, then you should be able to pick up easily and continue on. So once we get one or more of these elements selected, we might want to run methods on them, or probably want to run methods on them. So far, I've just been selecting little DOM elements, and we just see those in the F12 tools. And that doesn't really do anything for us except, playing in the F12 tools. So what we might want to do is actually take those. And once we take that wrapped set, we need to run one or more methods to actually get some stuff done. And we could do that with a technique called chaining. Now, of course, first, we could just run one method. But something else that we could do is run multiple commands on this wrap set, which is nice. So I can take a wrap set, get that selector. We're holding it in memory outside of the DOM for a moment while we go ahead and run some methods on it, which is kind of nice. And then you only need to access those DOM elements once. So once I have something with a method, I can then do more. So I could do stuff like and come over to CodePen again. And so I could do something like come in here and go back to F12 tools. I can maybe take all the paragraphs.
Zoom in on that.
Okay, as soon as I type. Zoom, it doesn't allow you to type while you're actually
If you hit
zooming.
Control-4, it does.
Does it?
Yeah.
Oh! It's not. Wait
a
a minute. Let's try this.
It's supposed to. That's called a live zoom, and it's supposed to work.
Oh, how do we like that? So that's something that I learned new today. And I use Zoom it like all the time. So I could come in here and change the, say, the background color. And I'll change that to red. And so if I run just this one, let me copy it so I have it. So if I run just that one piece, then it does absolutely nothing. Where's the... Oh, right. I need outputs. So in CodePen... Oops. So where am I going to see my output here, Jeremy, in CodePen?
You're too zoomed in. There should be an output pane, but you might be covered up with your developer tools.
Okay. And now Zoom it doesn't want to unzoom.
Control-4 gets you back
There we
out.
go.
There you go.
All right. So what did we want there?
I think you might need to hit F12 to collapse your developer pane.
Get rid of the dev tools and then just run it right in.
Yeah, you've got your dev tools overlaying your browser.
There we go. So that changes it to red. There we go, with the tools out of the way. Now I could do the same thing, but I'll change the CSS, like background color to red, and then I'll just do another one here with the foreground color as well. Which would be just color. And I could change that to green or something else. And I could go ahead and run that. And 2 dots doesn't work, so let's try that again. There we go. And so now I have red and green because that is just hideous. But here, as you see, I can have more than one, and it doesn't have to be the same exact method, but I can have any kind of methods that I want. I could append stuff, I could come in here and select it or do whatever, and I could have as many of these methods chained up like this as I need to. And the nice thing is that whatever was in that selector to begin with, the methods are all going to run off of that selector. All right, so it's going to set the background color for that wrapped set and then set the color for that wrapped set. And it just does one after another after another. And that makes it a little bit more performant because we don't have to keep reselecting those DOM elements and then reapplying that CSS to them or whatever it is that I'm applying to them. So that's kind of convenient. Chaining is awesome. Now, everything that is awesome like kind of goes up on a curve to a point on a chart, and then it goes and it drops down to awful. All right, so chaining can actually be awful too, because I see people who take it a little too far. You've probably seen this too, right? You know, if you're chaining like 17 times, I'm thinking maybe you want to do something else. There's one thing to have good performing code, and there's another thing to have code that you can't even read. So that happens when you go a little bit overboard with these things. So what I tend to do with chaining is, if I have like things that are, you know, similar, such as CSS, you know, if I'm applying all these different styling properties, they're alike, and so I take those and I apply those. And then I'll take other methods and apply other methods that are alike as well. So those kind of things kind of helps you have less chaining, but a good amount of chaining. So we don't want to have like 17 chain methods, but we don't want to have to avoid them altogether either. There's always that nice middle ground. All right. Okay, as you see on the slide, the selector, we just have method, selector.method, selector.method1, method2, and then of course inside the parens for each of those methods you might have, you know, whatever arguments or whatnot you're going to pass in. So it is, again, a really easy but really powerful way to get things done in jQuery. We don't want to get carried overboard with chaining, but we don't want to, you know, just avoid it altogether because we don't want to get carried overboard. So just think about your code, think about what you're doing before you do it, and then you'll be fine. So in summary, we took a look at selectors, and throughout the whole rest of the day, we're going to see selector, selector, selector. So even some of the samples that maybe didn't make it into here, we're going to see them during the day. And we're going to see lots of different fancy selectors and ways to work with them, along with lots of change methods and events and things like that as well. Filters, again, can help us. They're a different kind of selector, but they use a different notation with the colon in front of the selector. And usually it's a predefined selector like button or input or some other type of DOM element. And then we could take all of our selectors that we have and we could chain them together and run multiple commands on each of those wrapped sets, which all of this core part of jQuery is what really, really makes it so easy to work with. Right, we just get to work with our selectors and then just start calling those methods. And we'll see later, some of those methods will be cool events or effects rather. Right, so we'll have like all kind of fancy whiz-bang things going on with those.
Yeah. Tremendous.
Sounds good. Okay, so I only have a few resources here on the next slide, which is a big old, I guess we get to download the slides, right?
Yeah.
So you can find it in the slides. Getting started with mobile web development. Remember, again, mobile first, right? Always a good thing. And then, of course, the jQuery API. And you can just go right to the selectors category. And I'll just hop over there again real quick. All right, so jQuery.com, category, selectors. One day I'll learn how to type and spell, which is not going to be today. In here. So in here, I could come in here and grab my selectors. So anything in here that you need, go right under manipulation, works really well. Right, there we go. I think I just spelled that wrong before. There we go, selectors. So once I come in here, as you see, here's another one that didn't even make it on the slide. Animated. For some reason, I just never, ever had a need for that because I've just never had a need to find something that's been animated. I kind of know when it is, but it's there because somebody needs it. But as you see here, look at all of these different selectors. Here's our starts with and ends with, just a basic equals. Here's some of our filters or extensions. The class selector, right? Class is a classic. Parent-child. So, I mean, if you can't find a way to select something, just come here. It's going to be there.
I think that jQuery is one of those libraries where you should actually go to the documentation to a page like this and read through each one, because you'll find one and you'll say, oh, I didn't even know I needed to do it.
Yeah.
I didn't even know I could do that.
Right.
So as opposed to just waiting until you have the need and then going and looking up how to do it, go and actually read through them. Just glance at the descriptions of them. And you'll find that, for instance, there's one called nth child.
Yes.
And you can say nth child odd or even, and it's going to select every other element for you. And it's tremendously valuable. It's a little bit expensive. Some argue that it shouldn't be used, but tremendously valuable. So there are things like that you don't even know exist until you read the descriptions.
Yeah, that's why I always tell everybody, just go right to the website. This is where all of the good stuff is, just right actually at jQuery core website. So you can come in here and really just take a deep look at all these selectors, and then at least so you get them in your head. And then when you're developing and you say, hey, I need this set of elements, well, you'll have an idea of what to go for, right? Then you can revisit the page, come back and see exactly what you need. If things seem a little slow or it's just, not bringing back the elements exactly that you want. Right. So good stuff there. That's something I always tell people, just have that page open all day. Just stay in there. Long. If you're working in jQuery, just stay in there, have it all day.
Okay, so as I understand it now, next module you're going to be telling folks after they've selected things, here's what you can do to it, right?
Oh, imagine that. Yeah, we don't just select things and let them sit there. We actually want to do stuff with them.
I like to use the analogy, everybody knows their word processor. You open Microsoft Word and you say, I want to change some things. So first you go select some text, maybe the whole paragraph, maybe just one word. And then you go and you hit some buttons. I want to bold that and italicize it, and I want to do this stuff to it. But it's this two-step process we're all so familiar with that it makes a good analogy, because that's exactly what you're doing here. You're selecting some things on the page. and then you're affecting them somehow. Select and then affect. Select and then affect every time.
Yep.
All right.
How we
well,
roll.
let's go ahead and take a break, a 10-minute break, and we'll come back after that and learn all about jQuery manipulating the DOM after you've selected your DOM elements. See you soon.
See you soon.